Welcome to the Problematic Gaze with me, Dr. Lee Arnott.
And me, Dave Moore.
Each episode, we'll take a piece of pop culture from the last 60 years and examine it through the problematic lens. Is it problematic? If it is problematic, what does that say about society and culture then? And what does it say about society and culture now?
And before we take a deep dive into our chosen topic, we'll look at the news events of the day, we'll look at what was in the TV landscape, and we'll also look at the charts. So, how are you, Lee?
Beware the moon, David. Beware the moon. That's all I'm saying this week. Yeah. Apart from that, I'm very well. I have to just drop a little mention for a TV show I've watched and binged, which is most unlike me this week, which I'd like everybody to go and watch because it's fabulous, and that's Rivals on Disney. It's the updated version of the Jilly Cooper Bonkbuster, and it is so much fun. It's like what Howard's Way wanted to be in the 80s, but wasn't allowed to be. And cracking cast, really good storylines, a lot of sex. So don't watch with the kids or your parents, depending on your age. Actually, never watch with your parents, whatever age you are, if there's lots of sex. So yes, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I cannot recommend it enough. If you want something frothy, but that's kind of moving and then touches on politics and stuff as well, it's really good. And it's a proper snapshot of 1987 and 1988. So go and watch it. Lose a weekend to it, honestly.
I've heard really good things about that. I haven't got Disney Plus, so I might have to invest in that just to watch Rivals, because I've heard so many good things about it. And in particular, what I've heard is Danny Dyer is a revelation in it.
Yeah, but I always think that's a bit of a shame on Danny Dyer because, you know, I listened to an interview with him once and he was talking about when he was a young actor that Harold Pinter, you know, was really impressed with his stuff. So he's obviously got the talent, and he just got pigeonholed, didn't he? So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, he's amazing. And him and Catherine Parkinson's relationship is the kind of thread throughout the whole thing that I will confess I shed a tear at the end of the whole thing yesterday.
Have you binge watched the whole thing?
Yes. And that's not like me at all. But oh my God, it's just great. And it ends on a proper season cliffhanger like Dynasty and Dallas used to do.
Now, I have to say, you are sounding a bit Norman Collier my end, and that is because our internet is currently being powered by an asthmatic gerbil on a wheel. It is so slow, and I cannot wait until Wednesday when the engineer comes round and puts us on fibre optic broadband. So we're going to be going from a juddering mess internet-wise to, do you know when Doctor Who regenerates and all the energy comes out of his arms and legs and head and everything? Yeah. Our house is going to be glowing from the amount of internet connection we are going to have. I'm sure it's not going to be that easy. There will be some stumbling blocks on the way, but I can't wait.
Good. That'll be exciting. I won't say how ours has gone considerably downhill since we had the fibre optic, but you'd be happy with yours, hopefully.
Did you just say something then? Sorry, you broke up.
I had a bit of a sobering read this week, actually. As part of my research for my book, I've been looking at the Green Movement in early 70s in Britain. And I've read a thing that was published in 1972. It was a group of scientists got together, and I think it was published in the New Scientist or the Ecologist, and it's called A Blueprint for Survival. And it is all about how, you know, man's demand is outstripping the natural resources. And it was utterly terrifying. And it was written 50 years ago. And it was terrifying because all the things it was predicting are now happening. So I don't want to get too apocalyptic, but I have been buying an extra tin of cans and an extra tinned goods from the supermarket each time I visit, just to pop in the apocalypse cupboard, just to make sure. But it was interesting, apart from being ultimately depressing, is how this kind of kickstarted the whole green movement in Britain. And then you get The Good Life, you get Doctor Who in the early 70s has a lot of kind of eco storylines, you know. So yeah, it was just a kind of sobering read, but a really interesting snapshot of that early 70s, what was feeding into ideas for the apocalypse then, which got overtaken by the nuclear stuff in the 80s.
Can I just double check you've got a can opener as well?
Shit. On the list. It's on the list.
Flaw in your plan. So, do you know what happened to me this week that gave me a slight indication that we are approaching the apocalypse?
Oh, yeah.
I went to a farm shop in the Cotswolds. Okay. So, you know, you go to... So, okay, I should put it into context, me and hubby went to meet our good friends, and they'd kind of booked this posher than an Airbnb. It was a lovely Cotswolds cottagey kind of vibe, just for a couple of nights. We went away, had lovely food. It was in Stow-on-the-Wold, which is really close to Chipping Norton. So if you can imagine that, the whole Chipping Norton set was David Cameron, Rebecca Brooks, wasn't it, back in the day? Very kind of rah-rah, lots of Land Rovers, 4x4s.
Very Rivals, darling.
Very, very Rivals. Okay, so normally, you and me, we go to a little farm shop, probably like a little farm shop, so you can just like have a little browse around and buy a little lemon cake for like £2 or something, if that, buy a little pot plant for like 50p. This place, it was called Dalesford Organic, and this is not an advert for Dalesford Organic, we're not being paid by them, but we went in there, it was like Waitrose or John Lewis on acid. It was
really
the poshest farm shop you'll ever see in your life. It was full of people wearing wellies and their barbers, stuff, not casting aspersions on those people, but you can imagine the clientele that were there. And there was one thing that kind of encapsulated just how posh this place was. I kind of like collecting side plates. I don't know why. I like always having the different side plates, not all uniform. So I kind of looked at this side plate and I thought, oh, this is quite nice. Might get this. It was hand painted, but it was a pile of about 50 of them. Turned it over. Guess how much it was?
For a side plate? In a what, is it second hand or was it like artisanal?
No, artisanal.
Okay, £4.
£155.
You're joking.
I have to say,
fucking hell.
I have to say
did you hightail?
I have to say the Yorkshire in me came out.
I bet it did.
They had a temperature regulated cheese room.
God, we're not allowed to swear anymore, are we? But I'll.
Saying that we're not allowed to swear, do you know we've made a real valiant effort not to swear in our last podcast about Absolutely Fabulous? They still put a bloody explicit sign on it, so I don't know what we said.
Did they?
Maybe it's because we were referencing drugs.
Maybe. We're just too rock and roll. That's the problem.
We're just too rock and roll. They're always listening to us. Do you know what I mean? You can't get away with anything. You can't even fart without someone putting it down on a form.
All right, boomer.
He's so fucking woke.
I noticed I hadn't spotted this actually, a review on our podcast page from Maggie Moo 1. It's really lovely. It's quite long, so I won't read all of it. And obviously, we don't want to flick ourselves off our own reviews, which is clearly what we're doing. But
we're involving the community.
That's right. The hosts dissect beloved pieces of media with a mix of nostalgia and critical analysis that really opens your eyes to the layers of complexity beneath the surface. I mean, she's talking about us.
Wow.
Obviously true. The hosts do a brilliant job of balancing their love for the movie with a critical lens on picking how Pretty Woman, in this case, portrayal of wealth, romance and gender roles might be. I mean, she goes on and in a really lovely way. I'm quite emotional reading it, actually. It's
Are you sure she's got the right podcast?
Oh, no, this is it for Evolution of Horror. I'm so sorry. It's not for us. Yes, of course, it's for us. She name checks us. These episodes were a testament to what the problematic gay. Yeah, she mentions us. So that's lovely.
That's really nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
What is it, Maggie Moo?
Maggie Moo.
Well, I'm guessing Maggie Moo is a woman, but I don't know. I might be completely wrong.
I'm also wondering if that's her real name.
Yeah. Okay.
She's called Maggie Moo.
Well, thanks for that. That's really nice. It's nice to know that people are actually listening. Yeah. Can I just throw one right back at you? But it's very, very quick. It's from Gazer #1. So actually people are naming themselves after our podcast now.
Wow.
And it goes, I'm hooked. I love these two. Informative and so interesting. I learn something new every time and then it stops. I'm just wondering if this poor person, Gazer 1, had a stroke halfway through typing this and is no more. And actually their head fell onto the keyboard and just pressed send, and they could just still be lying there.
Maybe all they're hearing is just us on a loop, still going around and around and around. Maybe they're in a really happy place, darling.
This was sent on the 16th of October, so if anybody does know Gazer #1 out there, can you just go and check on them?
Just check they're all right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's lovely. Do keep them coming in.
Yes, please do. We really love to hear from you, and it's nice to involve our listeners in our podcast.
Yes.
I know we're kind of gabbling on, but I just want to just mention some other business before we crack on. Probably the most important piece of news that we've ever had. Sugar Babes are going on tour.
You're joking, when?
I think next year sometime.
Which lineup?
The original. I mean, I am all hashtag justice for Heidi, but...
I mean, obviously.
If push came to shove, I would go and see the originals.
I saw the originals back in the day. I love Siobhan. Obviously, yes. Let's discuss when we finish recording. Let's turn our attention to the business of the day then, looking at An American Werewolf in London, released in the UK on the 21st of August 1981. What's your relationship with this movie, Dave?
I watched this movie over and over again when I was young, and I think it was again when I was in the Middle East. Did I ever tell you why I lived in the Middle East?
Yes.
Where there wasn't many TV channels, etc., and you had to kind of rely on videos from the video shop, and this was one of the videos that we got, and I kind of wore it out watching American Werewolf in London. Absolutely loved it. It's probably not for youngsters' eyes, but back in the day, no one gave a shit what you watched, did they?
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, pretty much the same, actually. It was one of those films that parents allowed their kids to watch. I remember before it came out in the News of the World Sunday supplement, in which an advert appears in this film, a little cameo. I remember they had like a 2-page spread looking at the transformation scene, because obviously this was like nothing anybody's seen before. So it became, and because it was billed as a comedy horror and it was funny, and again, humor dates. So I used to laugh at a lot of this film, but I didn't this time, but I really enjoyed it. And so, yeah, my parents let me watch it, and I watched it at a really early age. And like you, watched it over and over again. The sequence of the dream where he's running through the forest and he sees himself on the bed, and then that horrible face appears, and that's that quick. He's got that horrible makeup on. I still have to almost turn away when that comes on from that kind of race memory of when I was a kid, not being able to look at that because that was too scary. But yeah, loved this film. Absolutely loved it.
For anyone who hasn't seen American Werewolf in London, do you want to give us a little brief synopsis of what it's about, Lee?
Yes. So, while on a trip to Europe, American friends Jack and David are attacked on the Yorkshire Moors by a creature. Jack is killed while David survives, but he's been bitten by the creature. 3 weeks later, having woken from a coma and now in the London hospital, strange things are happening to David. The mangled corpse of Jack appears and tells David he's turning into a werewolf. Unless he kills himself, he will himself kill. While staying at the flat of his new girlfriend and former nurse Alex, the full moon makes David painfully transform into a wolf, and he kills 6 people around London. Meanwhile, his former doctor, Dr. Hirsch, enlists the help of Alex, believing David may be under some psychotic delusion. After waking up in London Zoo, David has no recollection of the night before, but then he hears about the murders and runs from Alex, fearful he'll kill her. In a sex cinema, a now properly decomposed Jack and skeletal Jack introduces David to his victims the night before, who urge him to commit suicide, but it's too late. The moon has risen and he transforms again. After causing absolute carnage in Piccadilly Circus, the wolf is trapped in an alley by armed police. Alex breaks through the police cordon and tries to reason with the creature, but the creature is shot dead after going to attack her. The final shot of the film shows David transformed back into himself, dead among the rubbish.
So American Werewolf was released on the 21st of August 1981. So we're going to have a little look at the news events around that time. What have you found, Lee?
Well, one of the big news stories that year is about Peter Sutcliffe, who is arrested for the Yorkshire Ripper killings, which have kind of terrorised people in the north for years, haven't they? And finally, he's arrested. He will get charged that year on a technicality, which there was, I mean, the police investigation was so flawed. It just couldn't cope with, all the, I remember reading a book, I think you might have read this book as well. It's just about every single piece of information had to be written down on a separate index card. And so they're getting like thousands of pieces of information every hour, and all of it, there's just no space for this. So Sutcliffe trickles through the system, comes within reach twice, I think. And because the system is so incapable of dealing with it, he just gets away with more killings. It's horrible. What do you remember about it?
I lived in Bradford of the time that, he was still on the loose and still killing women. And I vividly remember my mum used to be an Avon lady, and she used to take me out with her because she didn't want to go on her own. And I remember distinctly she had this big red plastic rape alarm that when you press the button, it's a piercing scream. And my dad looked very much like him in the photo fit, he kind of like, the hair, the beard, the moustache and the goatee beard that was circulated around at the time. So, and then they came around to talk to my mum about, where was your husband this time? They basically kind of said to her, we know it's not him, but we have to just, box tick. And my mum used to say to me, I did think at the time, well, where was he on that night? There was a tiny inkling of just kind of like stopping and questioning, because the paranoia, we can't really imagine how the paranoia of everybody in Yorkshire and Manchester across the north of England was at this time of this man could strike at any time indiscriminately.
Yeah. Well, when the case got that false lead that claimed he was from the northeast, and they went up to the northeast at that point, I remember my dad was the milkman. So on a Thursday and Friday night, I think it was, they used to go collecting for the money. And in the winter, of course, and I remember my mum getting rape alarms at this point, and she testing them out in the house and stuff because that northeastern link had then come in by that point. So, God, it was grim, wasn't it? And it just speaks so much of no one took an interest in this case until it's a white middle class girl that's murdered. Mm-hmm. When it's sex workers, when it's women of color, nobody's bothered. I mean, the police force is so institutionally misogynist and homophobic and racist at that point. I want to say the more things change, but some of the other news events of this year are also, it's a fairly grim year in Britain, 1981. These hideous race riots across the country, Brixton, Toxteth, the National Front is becoming a huge force. Enoch Powell warns of racial civil war. I mean, this language that they're using then is just depressingly out in the open now on social media. It's just more things. I mean, there's hideous things happen. In July, that 4 members of an Asian Muslim family are killed by arson in their home in East London. The summer is just a hot mess in this country. This is the year of Ghost Town by the Specials. There's a feeling that everything's going really badly. Thatcher's really unpopular. It's obviously not going to be until the Falklands next year when her popularity suddenly swings. Yeah. Oh, it's grim. What beacons of light have we got in this year?
Well, we've got a couple that I've found. Depending on how you look at it, Lady Di and Charles, now King Charles, got engaged, and there was a wedding in July. He was 32 and she was 19. Yeah.
We had a street party for the wedding. I remember one for the Silver Jubilee, vaguely, because I was only 4. But I remember we had a big street party for this wedding. It was huge, wasn't it? It was enormous.
Yeah, we had a street party as well. Lots of Union Jacks waving around, all tables erected up and down the street. Massive kind of community event, really, wasn't it? All across the country.
Yeah. But then I'm looking at that and I was just thinking, God, I wasn't 8 years old being indoctrinated into this whole system of kind of serfdom with pretty frocks and crowns. Sorry, I'm so sorry if anybody is a royalist. I have nothing but respect, but I think it's an institution that's outdated, needs some shaking up, and promotes an unfairness in society, basically. But I was totally swept up in this fairy tale.
Another thing that's probably emblazoned across your memory, and I know that I remember this vividly, was when Doctor Who regenerated from Tom Baker to Peter Davidson.
This was major. I mean, Doctor Who had been Tom Baker forever. In my eyes, obviously. Already that slightly obsessive streak in me had revealed itself because that season, the music had changed. The music had been updated. The title sequence had changed. There was a whole new feel, there was a whole new vibe, and I couldn't really handle it. And at the end, when Tom regenerated into Peter Davison, well, I mean, I was ultimately destroyed for a while.
This, for me, I came into Doctor Who a little bit later than you. So for me, Peter Davidson was always my doctor. So I remember vividly, there was this man regenerated into Peter Davidson. I just remember being caught up in the kind of like the media furore. It was on the radio, it was on the TV, there was this big event about to happen. And that's what kind of garnered my interest. So for me, Doctor Who started when Tom Baker regenerated into Peter Davidson. And also, I just fell in love with Tegan immediately.
Obviously. Yeah. It was a big shock for my 8-year-old. I think it was probably, in retrospect, it was probably the first time I dealt with grief looking at it. And obviously it was a TV show, so people didn't really get what I was going through. But actually, for me, that's the first person who died, who was in my life all the time. Wow, that's
interesting.
Yeah, wow. Anyway, wow, that's just blown my mind. On a happier note, a month after that, Bucks Fizz win Eurovision. I mean, what an event, what an evening.
If you're a gay of a certain age, this is emblazoned.
If you're anybody of a certain age, this is emblazoned, because remember the fact that two men ripped the longer skirts off to reveal two mini skirts on the women dancing beside them, doing a very basic jive step, blew the collective mind of the nation and Europe in 1981, tells you all you need to know about how sophisticated dance routines and choreography was in 1981. But yeah, I was in North Yorkshire watching it on holiday. Yeah,
were you? Whereabouts in North Yorkshire?
Robin Hood's Bay.
Well, do you know what? Our paths may have crossed very, very early. You never know.
Might have done. Yeah.
Might have been side by side, building sandcastles on the beach or on a donkey. Not the same donkey.
No, that'd be weird.
So, because we're looking at movies this week, why don't we look at the top 10 grossing movies in the UK in 1981? At number 10, Private Benjamin. I adore that film. So
do I. I wonder how that's aged. Probably like old cheese, isn't it? That'd be quite an interesting one to look at some point. But yeah, I loved it too. Because for me, it looked like in my 8-year-old eyes, she was this strong woman standing up to the blokes, which is already my default position. But I reckon now it's probably a misogynist hot mess, isn't it?
Number 9, French Lieutenant's Woman. Got no connection with this film whatsoever. I don't think I've seen it. It's a Meryl Streeper, isn't it?
I haven't seen it. I've tried to read the book, couldn't really get into it. Number 8, the one we're looking at in our episode, An American Werewolf in London. Number 7, Chariots of Fire. I remember I was never that interested. I was 8.
Dull, wasn't it? Yeah. It wasn't for us. Wasn't aimed at us.
It wasn't aimed at us. No, wasn't aimed. I've never seen it since either. However, I did see 9 to 5, which wasn't aimed at us, but I managed to see that as an 8-year-old. So. Go figure.
I wonder why we were drawn to 9 to 5. What could it have been about 9 to 5?
I couldn't honestly say, David, honestly. But I did go to cinema to see number 5, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I absolutely loved. It's a bit of a cracking top five, isn't it? You've got Any Which Way You Can, that Clint Eastwood and the orangutan film. Did you ever see those?
I did. I quite enjoyed them at the time, but I mean, I'm sure looking back, they're probably just a bit naff.
Yeah. Probably, yeah. Flash Gordon, number 3. I mean, I loved that film. I think I saw that 3 times at the cinema. That film.
Did you? What drew you to Flash Gordon? Was it Flash Gordon?
No, it was the heavy science fiction plotting and depth of characterization. Yeah, of course, it was Flash Gordon.
He was a beautiful man, wasn't he?
Oh,
the guy who played. Vocal. We don't even know what his name is.
Google him. But get your tenor ladies on. For Your Eyes Only, number 2. And number 1?
Superman 2. Now, I love Superman 2, and obviously things were stirring in my loins at the time because it wasn't essentially Superman that I fancied. It was the 3 villains.
Yes.
Who were all dressed in black, weren't they? Yeah. There was Terence Stamp, Sarah Douglas, and forgive me, I can't remember the name of the third guy.
Yeah. It was the third one, the mute one, that I really took a shine to. But this was the same time I fancied Darth Vader, so that was my kind of style book.
Maybe it was for me, it was the outfits. They were just kind of like shiny patent leather outfits, weren't they? There was just something about the 3 of them. I think it was their villainy, it was their powers, the way they could just throw people across the room with just like waving their hand. They used to blow people across the room, didn't they? I mean, psychologically, I don't know what that did to me in my future life. But anyway, let's gloss over that. But yeah, really fancied all 3 of those. So these charts were, I can very definitely say that the music in these charts would be stuff that I was just listening to on the radio. This was kind of pre me taking an interest in music and the charts.
The top 40, Body Talk, Imagination. I remember that because it was 3 very hot black guys on top of the pops. Auntie Lynn was really into Susie and the Banshees and Visage.
ABBA was still floating around at this point. Number 28, Lay All Your Love on Me, which peaked at number 7, which is one of my favourite ABBA songs.
Yes, me too. Chemistry, the Nolans underneath. Again, I remember that one. I remember the Can Bad Manners because I remember it came on the radio and I grabbed my jacket and put it around my waist like a skirt and did the Can living. My mother walked in and said, "What you doing?" And I went, "Nothing, ma'am."
Speaking of the specials, Ghost Town at number 22, peaked at number 1.
There we go. I mean, that's a great song. That speaks so much of what Thatcher's Britain was like at this point, the depression, the empty shops, so much like today in lots of ways. Depeche Mode, the Jacksons, UB40, For Your Eyes Only, obviously, the theme tune to the Bond movie.
Okay, so let's go into the top 10 then.
Tainted Love, Soft Cell. Absolutely adored that song. Remember my Auntie Lynn babysitting me and her dancing like Mark Almond because she said, "You've got a right spiteful face." Tight Fits, follow-up single, Happy Birthday, Stevie Wonder, obviously, classic. Electric Light Orchestra, Girls on Film, Duran Duran, number 5. Number 4, Japanese Boy. That was the first single I ever bought. Possibly quite a problematic song that we should maybe have a little short episode on at some point. Number 3, Love Action, I Believe in Love, The Human League. Love that song. This is a cracking top 10, actually, really.
It really is.
It's all going to go horribly wrong at number 1, isn't it?
Yeah, so just before we move on to number 1, number 2, Hooked on Classics, Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. Don't know that one. I
think they'd released an album of them doing covers of like songs like Bohemian Rhapsody. And my parents bought it because obviously it was classic music. And that was my introduction to classical music, my only access to classical music. Shall I have a look at what's number 1 then?
Okay, drum roll please, while Lee reveals the number 1 song from this week in 1981.
Oh my God, it's Shaky. Shakin' Stevens, number 1 at Green Door. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our show, when we regularly do these top 40s, Shaking Stevens, no matter seemingly what the decade or year, will have a song in the charts. And there he is. Oh, I'm quite pleased. I thought it was going to be some hideous novelty song or some sex offender that we weren't allowed to talk about anymore. So I'm actually delighted to see Shaking Stevens in his rightful place at number 1.
In his rightful place. I kind of know what I'm going to get you for Christmas this year.
Is it Shaky?
Shaky's Greatest Hits, the quadruple album of Shaky's Greatest Hits.
Yeah. Wow.
Through the decades.
20 songs for every decade.
Okay, so American Werewolf in London. Now, I know you are a horror buff.
It's funny, because I never actually really think of this as a horror film, but obviously it is a horror film, I guess, because it's so familiar. But yeah.
It's funny you should say that, because as I watched it as a child, obviously all the horror and the gore elements kind of sprung out to me. But actually watching it again last night, it's really funny, really short as well. It's only kind of just almost 90 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a really tight script, isn't it? It's really just kind of flies over. There's nothing wasted in it at all. Yeah, comedy horror, it's got a bit of a checkered past, but there is some good stuff out there. And if it's done with a knowing way, then it's funny that like Shaun of the Dead, newer films like Bodies, they really tap into the humor really well. And this one, there's some really kind of witty humor in this film as well. The bit when he's naked in the zoo. And I mean, there's elements of farce in it, obviously. He's trying to cover up his dignity, but like he bumps into an old lady who just gives a kind of classic old lady reaction and then steals some balloons from a little boy who then goes to his mum. And there's just that classic line, "The naked American stole my balloons, mummy," and it's just funny. And then he's trying to style out wearing this woman's coat he's nicked at the bus stop. The stuff with the corpses in the cinema, Jack, his friend, is just like decomposing more and more. It's disgusting.
Okay, so let's just kick off. So we start off on the Yorkshire Moors, or is it? I believe this might have been filmed in Wales.
Yeah.
But it starts off almost as though we think it's going to be kind of like a road trip movie between these two guys, don't we? They're kind of walking along the moors in Yorkshire and stumble across a pub called the Slaughtered Lamb. Where they're not exactly given the warmest of welcomes, shall we say.
Well, they're given that kind of cliched welcome from Westerns, aren't they? When they walk in, everybody goes silent, and nothing stirs and they just get looked at. I think he's very much playing on those cliches when he's doing it. Interestingly, another little snapshot of history in this film, and this film is a great visual representation of 1981 Britain, which I will talk about, but it's the fact that this pub only has men in it. And there's only one woman in it. And for a lot of pubs up and down the country, men pubs were male-only homosocial spaces, you know, and this is obviously a working-class pub, so, you know, there might be a ladies' lounge, but they get a welcome, which is clearly get out, but stick to the road, they're told, and then off they go, and then it all goes tits up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the pub scenes. Brian Glover was there, Rick Mail was there, and two really great performances from Paul Schofield, who I just think is just like quite a mesmerising, powerful actor, isn't he? Yeah. And Lila Kay, who plays the pub landlady / barmaid, she was just fab, such a powerhouse, wasn't she?
Yeah. And actually, the cast is really, really good. You know, John Woodvine, who plays Dr. Hirsch, he's a legend, really. And I think John Landis, the director, had seen him put an RSC production of Nicholas Nickleby in New York and cast him. He'd known Jenny Agutter for years. I wasn't 100% convinced by Jenny Agutter's performance at the beginning, but by the end of it, I totally bought into her when she had some meaty stuff to do. And I will talk about her character in a bit. But I mean, I think those two are the kind of thread throughout the whole film. And it's when they start to accept what's happening to David, the character, you know, that I think you really believe them when they're kind of desperate. And I really felt for her at the end, actually. I thought she was really good.
So the pub scenes, I thought what was really good was the fact that this American director had really managed to capture and encapsulate the Yorkshire vibe of this place, in the script, and hiring actors that were convincing as, Yorkshiremen. And
I mean, that you can see when they send the boys out that the characters are genuinely conflicted about it. And I think Brian Glover's character said it's in God's hands now, you know. But yeah, they're great sequence, you know, but the classic, the unwelcome villagers and what secrets do they have? In this case, a conspiracy to cover up a werewolf.
Absolutely, yeah. So they it really built up the, it imparted a lot of information about what was happening here. That, you talked about, there was a pentacle on the wall which was supposed to kind of represent warding off wolf-like spirits or something. And it really kind of built up the fear as though actually when these two American fish out of waters are ejected from this pub, something is going to happen to them.
And indeed it does, and they're attacked. And then we get the first kind of exposure to the makeup for which this film is rightly lauded. You know, it wins an Oscar for the special effects and makeup, which is the first time it's had it that year, I think. And yeah, and Jack's killed and David wakes up in London 3 weeks later where he meets Nurse Alex. What's your take on Nurse Alex? I've got quite a lot of thoughts of Nurse Alex.
The fragrant, beautiful, ephemeral Nurse Alex. Yeah, so my view on Nurse Alex is obviously played by Jenny Agutter, who is beautiful, very upper class, cut glass English accent, quite unlike any nurse I've ever encountered. So that was one element that it was unrealistic, but at the same time, I could see why she was portrayed in that way. Her character didn't have a huge amount of depth to her, and I found some of her reactions to what was going on when David was talking about, I think I'm a werewolf, etc. And she was just basically saying, oh, this is obviously a result of psychological trauma. But even after the news that 6 people had been hideously mutilated in London once David had turned into a werewolf, and he came back to her and said, I think something happened last night. The doctor calls her and says, is David with you? Have you read the papers today? There was still an element of like, oh, it's okay. He's just, he's just going through something psychologically. Yeah. There wasn't any kind of, oh, shit, this man's an absolute lunatic, but I love him, so I'm going to gloss over it and I'm going to cuddle him in bed.
Yeah, I got to think about this, and nurses as a kind of sexualized figure for heterosexual men, as I understand it, and Alex, very much as you say, is a posh girl. I mean, I had to laugh when she's taking him back to her apartment. Not appropriate, Alex. He might be quite psychotic. And as she's walking through Earl's Court, she says, I'm just a working girl, so don't expect too much. And she goes into this absolutely apartment that would be split into 5 these days. And but I was thinking of her as a nurse, in her uniform, and she is this posh girl, and she, just to get a bit historical and kind of looking at kind of gendered roles here, she very much calls into the stereotype that England has since the First World War, when posh girls from families would go across to be nurses in battlefields or in France, and so stories about these posh girls suddenly falling in love with captains and stuff. And you get this stereotype of the posh English Rose as a nurse kind of, and she's feeding into that, I guess. And this fantasy of a nurse. And I was thinking about nurses' uniforms. There's no fucking God reason on this earth why nurses had to wear an A-line skirt that came just above the knee, just enough to be able to be called practical, but short enough to be titillating, And when I was recently watching my PhD and I looked at the changes of army uniforms for women, they'd feminize them. They'd give them little pussy bows and stuff on a fucking army uniform. They're kind of saying there's no reason on God's planet why a nurse should not be in trousers, any point in history. So Alex is really feeding into this kind of multi-layered fantasy figure of the nurse. And she takes him back to his apartment. And of course she says, I find you very attractive, which is what this ultimate kind of apotheosis of this fantasy would be. The nurse takes you back and seduces you, So I did feel she was a bit of a cipher in that respect. But as I said, I felt for her at the end. I can't lie.
Yeah.
She just say to him at one point, I've had 7 lovers in my life. 3 of them are one night stands. I thought, why have you said that? Why is the bloke written you to say that? You're just kind of, are you showing the audience that she's not a virgin? It was just a bit of it just so speaks of the way women were written and treated,
Well, I wonder how, in that respect, how much that's a clumsy attempt to portray her as a modern woman who's kind of open about her sexuality. But yeah, and also I wonder how much they chose someone like Jenny Agutter to play this role, because obviously they had to think about the optics in America and how Americans see English women.
She was a good pal of John Landis. She'd lived in LA for a bit and knew him and his wife very well. And so when the part was written, he had her in mind from the very beginning. So it was a done deal for her.
What did you think about David?
I really liked David. I really fancied him when I was a kid. His character comes across as decent. He's the everyman. He's attractive, but not too attractive. He's a great leading man in this case. And I think he handles the realization that he is turning into a werewolf and he is becoming a killer. I think he handles all that very well. The transformation scene, should we talk about that for a minute? The makeup and that transformation scene, because it is just astonishing. To know that was all done with practical effects. It took them, I think this took them 3 weeks to film it. It's still amazing to look at. I'll post some bits of it on our social media. Just jaw-dropping, isn't it? The effects that are achieved, and it looks excruciating. The process he undergoes looks so painful, and so it still blows my mind looking at it.
It must have been mind-blowing at the time, because I don't think there would have been anything quite like this before. Obviously, we mentioned in previous episodes about the first forays into kind of this prosthetic experimentation in films and stuff, but you can really feel every bone-crunching moment of this transformation. I think it's really well shot. I think John Landis, in retrospect, said he felt like he kind of lingered on it a little bit too long, but I just think every shot is really considered. I thought the way that the hackles rose on his back were really effective, to feel these bones punching the skin as they kind of expand.
Yeah, I mean, before that, we'd seen when werewolf transformations, again, I'll post them on our social media, have been like shot of a man, cut away to something else, camera cuts back, and he's got extra hair on his face, or there's a slow fade as he gets more and more hairy between, always very static, very still. So this, I think, really kind of was such a dynamic sequence, and it's rightly celebrated and recognised for being seminal, Can I just mention the bits of 1981 London I absolutely loved seeing in this film? I thought was a really interesting social history piece. First of all, the NHS really made me laugh. The food looks exactly the same as it does these days. I love the fact that this version of the NHS is so well staffed that Alex can just go and sit by David all night, just reading at him, I love the fact the NHS in this film was multicultural. Punks on the tube. She mentions the inflation at the supermarket. There's a sequence when Alex goes to work and leaves David in his flat on his own all day. And in the days before mobile phones, tablets, this is what people just did. They got so bored. He turns the TV on, and this TV is just a great snapshot of Britain. On Channel 1, you've got the test card. On the second channel, you've got darts. On the third channel, you've got an advert for Naughty Nina's memoirs in the News of the World that weekend. Naughty Nina was a genuine Page 3 girl, by the way. They filmed that advert especially for that little sequence. So
Oh, I love that sequence with Naughty Nina and the news of the world. It was a real kind of flashback to that time. And we talked about Pastry Girls, didn't we, in our second episode? So yeah, that was a real nice little snapshot.
I love seeing Tottenham Court Road Station. Tottenham Court Road Station is never that empty at night time now. And that sex cinema and that porno film, they especially shot that porno film. It's called See You Next Wednesday. And there's a poster for it in the Tottenham Court Road corridors he's running along. So it was a little in joke. Again, they made this little cheap porno, a fake porno.
Yeah, that was with Lindsay Drew, wasn't it? I think she was a famous porno star at the time.
Also, I thought that the victims of the killings on the first night were kind of very indicative of London that time. You get that posh yuppie couple, you get the three down and outs by the river when the South Bank was a shithole, and then you get the businessman coming off the tube. I mean, that whole sequence in the tube tunnels is just a masterpiece, isn't it? Speaking of great sequences, the end of that chase through the tube tunnels, just at the very end where you see the creature at the beginning coming up the stairs after him, you just catch a glimpse of it. Still scares the shit out of me. But just that little sequence, it's so creepy.
So David runs into a sex cinema in Piccadilly Circus, which, we kind of had a look round there the other day, didn't we? And it used to be a gap, but now it's just kind of empty at the moment. Yeah,
the other thing interesting about this is you get the sense of Soho as the centre of the British sex industry at this point, which of course it was, and it is grimy, it's sleazy, it's got a really shit reputation, it's run by drugs barons, and this sequence is just, it blows my mind what he was able to achieve. David transforms into a wolf, breaks out of the cinema, and is unleashed on Piccadilly Circus on a busy night time, and it is carnage. There's buses crashing, cars crashing into each other, people getting decapitated, and people getting squashed, cars driving through shop windows, people running, screaming. It's just so well done. And although he built a replica of Piccadilly Circus, they were able to stop the traffic, I think, 3 times.
Yeah, I think it's really well interlaced. Apparently they only had about 2 or 3 hours, the local council granted them 2 or 3 hours to, over a series of nights, to set up the shots they wanted. But obviously any kind of crashes, people being run over or going through car windscreens, etc., they would have to recreate that. I think it was at Twickenham Studios they did. So the way they interlace these scenes and these shots is just really, really clever. And also, just while we're mentioning special effects, I wanted to mention about the rain effects. There's a sequence where the Doctor goes back up to the slaughtered lamb to kind of, ingratiate himself with the locals and try and glean what's happening to David back in London. And he kind of exits the car, and the rain, the driving rain, which can only be achieved by rain machines, I thought was just brilliant. Great, really well shot. The special effects. It's stuff that you don't even realise is happening.
I've got only one last point to talk about this film, and that is the sex and the shower scene when Alex and David get it on, because I think it was one of the most sexless, passionless things I have ever seen in my life. Now, I understand that they cut a lot of it out to get the R rating, but oh my God. I mean, as an 8-year-old, I thought it was really sexy and hot, but it's so not. Thoughts?
Yes, I made a note about this that I felt it was quite tame. But also, I did find it kind of like vaguely erotic. I thought it was very, like, when they're in the shower, I thought that was quite a nicely shot, passionate moment between them. But then when they got to the bedroom they were just kind of basically moving on top of each other, weren't they? There wasn't really that much going on.
And I think the problem is that the actor playing David was stage kissing in a different way to the way Jenny Agutter uses stage kisses, and that Jenny Agutter is very much a product of the British stage kissing system, where you just pucker up and don't move your face or your mouth at all. I see David slips his tongue in there, and she's a bit like, It really reminded me of Dynasty, when these awful love scenes between Blake Carrington and Crystal. Blake, like, in his 70s, Crystal in her early 40s. A bit like Donald Trump and Melania. And whenever they did their kissing scenes, they would both be just these static. They just give a little kiss mouth, but then just hold their lips in exactly the same position, closed, and then just move their heads from side to side, but really slowly. And it was really creepy, and it was creepy here. And I just thought it was no.
It's a bit like Kath and Kim, when Kath and Kel have their little snogs.
Exactly. But in fact, it was like the exact opposite speed So Kath and Kim was just, they were just like really going for it. Whereas this and Dynasty, it was like a slow motion snail copulation, really.
Okay, so yeah, there's something I want to chat about very briefly about when I was watching it, I was thinking, is there a hidden meaning to this film? A subliminal story going on, on top of it being a comedic take on the werewolf films. And I did a bit of reading, and apparently John Landis has alluded to it being about survivors' guilt, about Jewish people who survived the death camps in the Second World War. There's a sequence, when the two boys initially get attacked and Jack is being savaged by the werewolf and David turns round and runs. And then it's kind of alluded to throughout this that he feels tremendously guilty about running away from him and not trying to help him. And he, apologises to the decomposing Jack later on. And then when he sees all the people as a werewolf he's killed in the sex cinema, there's a tremendous sense of guilt there as well. There's a couple of dream sequences where these kind of like Nazi clothes wearing zombies come in and murder his entire family, and there's nothing he can do about that. So, I don't want to touch too deeply into it, but that's what John Landis has alluded to in the past, that's kind of like a deeper meaning for what's going on in the movie, because then it kind of makes sense of why that sequence is there with the zombies coming in and killing his entire family back in America, because otherwise you're a bit like, well, why is this being slotted in? So yeah, just towards the end of the film, it ends very abruptly. So, David is as a werewolf. He's chased through the streets of London by police marksmen. Jenny Agutter breaks through the cordon and kind of runs to the end of this dark alley. I felt as though the film has a really, really good setup, but quite a flimsy ending. It's just quite abrupt, and it just stops with him being shot, returning to his human form. Jenny Agutter saying, "I love you, David," to a hairy, snarling werewolf, which I thought was quite bizarre. And then he's shot, he comes back to his normal form, obviously he's dead, end of film. There's no kind of wrapping up, if you know what I mean. I felt that was just as though it just kind of like ran out of steam towards the end, really, after the brilliant sequence in Piccadilly Circus.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? Because that sequence in Piccadilly Circus is so strong that how do you follow it? Is anything going to feel a bit anticlimactic after that? I was quite moved by it. I was quite affected by it. And I quite liked the sudden, but then I was raised on Hammer horrors, which end with the burn your house and then you're done. Bye, see you next week. See ya. Do
you know what I would have liked, just with my little directing head on? I felt as though, to have her just stood over his naked body, just felt of a bit of a disconnect there. I thought you could wrap that up with her going down to him and holding him, and maybe his just final breaths, looking into her eyes. And do you know what I mean? I think that's the way I would have liked it.
This is you being Sandra Dee again, love. Looking for the rainbow. Always looking for the rainbow, darling. Give over. It's brutal. We like it.
It's brutal, but I just felt it would have added a little bit of texture to it, darling. What can I say? I'm a romantic at heart.
It was all a dream within a dream.
Anyway. The end. So that was An American Werewolf in London. Really enjoyed that. Lee, thanks for suggesting it. That was obviously dedicated to all those people out there who celebrate the pagan festival of Halloween.
Happy Halloween, everybody. It's the one festival of the year I can really get behind. And what were we doing next week, Dave?
We're gonna lighten it up a little bit. We're gonna be watching a seminal classic sitcom from the 70s, Fawlty Towers.
Yes, a fairly well-known one for us to get our teeth into. And we'll be looking at what is now a controversial episode entitled The Germans, where we'll be really discussing xenophobia and casual racism in a lighthearted manner. So let's see. And obviously, don't mention the war because, well, let's discuss next week.
Don't mention the war. If you are familiar with Fawlty Towers, or even if you're not, we're going to be discussing the antics of Basil, Sybil, Manuel, and Polly. So, shall we say goodbye to our listeners and discuss Sugar Babes tickets?
Yes, please. Yes. Until next week then, Dave. Adieu.
Adieu, justice for Heidi.